There's a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you slept. You wake up tired. You cancel plans you were actually looking forward to. You feel vaguely anxious, but you can't explain why. And somehow, your life feels smaller than it used to. Psychologists have a name for what causes this. It's not burnout from work. It's not stress from circumstances. It's called social drain. And in almost every case, it traces back to specific people in your immediate environment. Not strangers, people you know, people you might even care about. This video is not about learning to hate anyone. It's about understanding what certain behavioral patterns do to your brain, your nervous system, and your long-term mental health. Because once you can see these patterns clearly, you cannot unsee them. And that clarity might be the most protective thing you ever give yourself. Here are 10 types of people that behavioral psychology says are genuinely harmful to be around.
Before we get into it, one thing worth saying up front. Toxic behavior doesn't always look toxic. In fact, the most damaging people in your life rarely announce themselves. They don't show up with warning signs. They show up as friends, as colleagues, as people who seem to genuinely care. The pattern only becomes visible over time, and by the time most people recognize it, the damage is already done. So let's start from the beginning. Type 1.
The gaslighter. You say something happened. They tell you it didn't. You express how you feel. They tell you you're overreacting. You confront them about something they clearly did, and somehow, by the end of the conversation, you're the one apologizing. This is gaslighting, and it's not just a buzzword. It's a documented psychological manipulation tactic first described by psychiatrists in the 1960s, named after a 1944 film in which a husband systematically manipulates his wife into questioning her own sanity. Here's what it does to the brain. Research published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology shows that repeated exposure to contradictory information from someone you trust creates what's called cognitive dissonance overload. Your brain receives two conflicting signals, your own perception and the other person's version of reality. And when this happens repeatedly, the brain doesn't always side with you. It starts to doubt itself. Psychologist Robin Stern, author of The Gaslight Effect, describes it as a slow erosion of your own sense of reality. You stop trusting your instincts. You stop trusting your memory. You stop trusting yourself. The most important sign to watch for: if you consistently leave conversations with someone feeling more confused about your own experience than when you started, that is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns like this don't fix themselves.
Type 2. The chronic critic. There's a difference between someone who gives you honest feedback and someone who tears you down under the disguise of honesty. One builds, the other just destroys. The chronic critic has a specific pattern. They comment on everything you do. They highlight every flaw, every mistake, every gap between where you are and where they think you should be. But here's what they almost never do: offer a solution, suggest an alternative, actually help. Psychologist Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness shows that repeated exposure to criticism without guidance, especially in formative relationships, teaches the brain to stop trying. Not because the person lacks ability, but because the brain has learned that effort leads to pain, not progress. This is why chronic criticism is especially damaging in close relationships. A study from the University of Washington found that the ratio of positive to negative interactions in healthy relationships sits at roughly 5-to-1. 5 positive exchanges for every 1 critical or negative one. When that ratio flips, the relationship itself becomes a source of psychological harm. The chronic critic rarely realizes what they're doing.
Some genuinely believe they're helping, but impact is not determined by intention. It's determined by what actually happens to the person on the receiving end. And what happens is a slow dismantling of confidence from the inside out.
Type 3. The drama magnet. Every conversation is a crisis. Every small inconvenience is a catastrophe. Every minor conflict becomes a full-scale emotional emergency. At first, you feel empathy. You want to help. You listen, you support, you show up. But after a while, you start to notice something. The problems never actually get resolved. New ones always appear. And somehow, you always leave these interactions feeling worse than when you arrived. This is not coincidental. Psychologists describe a pattern called trauma dramatization, where individuals who have not developed healthy emotional regulation skills unconsciously amplify conflict as a way of processing emotional distress. The drama is not calculated, but it is consistent. And here's the neurological reality of spending time around it. Research on emotional contagion, first documented by psychologist Elaine Hatfield, shows that humans unconsciously mirror the emotional states of those around them. When you spend extended time with someone in chronic emotional dysregulation, your own nervous system begins to mirror that state. Your cortisol levels rise, your threat detection system activates, you become more reactive, more anxious, more emotionally depleted. Not because anything happened to you directly, but because proximity to chaos is itself a form of stress exposure. Type 4, the fake supporter. They cheer for you in public. They celebrate your wins loudly. They say all the right things. But there's something slightly off. Something you can't quite articulate until the day you need them and they're not there. Or worse, you find out they were never really in your corner. Psychologists call this a duplicitous attachment pattern. On the surface, the relationship appears warm and mutually supportive, but beneath it, there's a subtle but consistent dynamic of social comparison and competition. Research from the University of Michigan found that exposure to what they called frenemies, people who are simultaneously supportive and undermining, actually produces more psychological stress than dealing with an openly hostile person. Why? Because the brain can prepare for a known threat. What it cannot easily handle is uncertainty. When someone's behavior is inconsistent, warm one moment, cold the next, your nervous system stays in a permanent low-grade state of alert, always scanning, always unsure. And that chronic uncertainty is exhausting in a way that's very hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. The science is clear on this. Ambivalent relationships, the ones that feel both close and unsafe, are more damaging to long-term mental health than purely negative ones, because you can't simply walk away from someone who sometimes feels like an ally. That ambiguity keeps you stuck, and while you're stuck, the damage continues. Type 5, the energy vampire. Every interaction leaves you drained. Not tired in a physical sense, drained in a way that's harder to describe, like something was taken from you. And you're not sure what. The energy vampire isn't necessarily malicious. They're often just deeply absorbed in their own emotional world. Every conversation circles back to their problems, their stress, their needs. And over time, you stop being a person to them. You become a resource. Psychologist Judith Orloff, who has written extensively on this phenomenon, describes it as a one-directional emotional transaction. One person gives, one person takes, and the giving person gradually depletes. There's a physiological component to this. Research on social interaction and the autonomic nervous system shows that certain interpersonal dynamics, specifically those characterized by high emotional demand and low reciprocity, activate the body's stress response in ways that mirror mild but chronic trauma exposure. Your heart rate variability shifts, your cortisol baseline rises. Your capacity for empathy, which is a finite resource, not an infinite one, begins to erode. This is called compassion fatigue, and it's not a personal failing, it's a biological response to sustained one-sided emotional labor.
Type 6. The narcissist. Now, this word gets used loosely, so let's be precise about what it actually means. Narcissistic personality disorder, as defined in the DSM-5, involves a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a chronic need for admiration, and a significant lack of empathy for others. But clinical diagnosis aside, narcissistic behavioral traits exist on a spectrum, and even subclinical narcissistic behavior in close relationships produces measurable psychological harm. Here's the core dynamic. In a relationship with a narcissistic individual, you exist primarily as an extension of them. Your role is to reflect, validate, and admire. When you fulfill that role, things feel warm, even wonderful. But the moment you express an independent need, a boundary, a perspective that contradicts theirs, the dynamic shifts rapidly. Psychologist Sandy Hotchkiss describes this as the narcissistic collapse, a disproportionate reaction to perceived criticism or rejection. What's particularly damaging about long-term proximity to this pattern is what it does to your sense of self. Research on relationships with high narcissism individuals shows consistent findings across studies. Partners and close associates report progressive loss of confidence, difficulty identifying their own needs, and a diminished sense of personal identity. You slowly stop asking what you want because you've learned that question doesn't matter here.
Type 7. The passive aggressor. They never say they're angry, but you always know they are. It's in the silence that lasts a little too long, the fine that means anything but fine, the sarcastic comment delivered with a smile, the favor done with just enough reluctance to make you feel guilty for asking. Passive aggression is defined in psychology as the indirect expression of hostility through actions rather than words. And it's particularly difficult to address because it's designed to be deniable. When you confront it, they say you're imagining things, you're too sensitive, you're reading into it, and suddenly you're back to doubting yourself. Sound familiar? There's significant overlap between passive aggression and gaslighting. Both rely on the target's self-doubt as the mechanism of control. The key difference is intent. Gaslighters manipulate deliberately. Passive aggressors often operate from unresolved emotional patterns they themselves may not fully understand. But here's what matters. Regardless of intent, living or working closely with chronic passive aggression creates a specific kind of psychological wear. You're always reading between the lines, always trying to decode the real message, always managing someone else's unspoken emotional state. And that hypervigilance, over time, is genuinely exhausting.
Type 8. The perpetual victim. Let me be careful here, because there's an important distinction. There are people who have genuinely been through incredibly difficult things, who are working through real pain, who deserve patience, compassion, and support. That is not who we're talking about. We're talking about a different pattern. Someone who has built their entire identity around being wronged, where every situation, no matter how neutral, gets interpreted as evidence that the world is against them, where accountability is never accepted, where change is never really pursued, because on some level, the victim identity has become more comfortable than growth. Psychologists describe this as a fixed victimhood schema, a cognitive framework through which all experiences are filtered. And here's why proximity to it is damaging. When someone consistently refuses accountability in a relationship, the accountability has to go somewhere, and it almost always lands on you. You find yourself over-explaining, over-apologizing, walking on eggshells, constantly adjusting your behavior to avoid triggering their narrative. And in doing so, you slowly give away your own agency, your own sense of fairness, your own voice. This is not about lacking compassion for people who struggle. It's about recognizing when a pattern is taking something from you that you're not getting back.
Type 9, the compulsive liar. Everyone bends the truth occasionally. That's human. But there's a specific type of person for whom deception isn't occasional. It's a default mode of operating. They lie about small things, things that don't even matter, which is precisely what makes it so disorienting. Research on pathological lying, published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, describes it as a pattern where deception becomes reflexive rather than strategic. The person isn't always lying to gain something specific. Sometimes they lie simply because it's how they've learned to navigate the world. The psychological impact on those around them is well documented. When you cannot reliably distinguish truth from fiction in a relationship, your brain enters a state of chronic low-level hypervigilance. Every piece of information gets mentally flagged for verification. Every interaction carries an undercurrent of uncertainty. Over time, this erodes not just trust in that person, but your capacity for trust in general. Research on betrayal trauma shows that repeated experiences of deception from close others can fundamentally alter how the brain processes social information. You become more suspicious, more guarded, more isolated. Not because something is wrong with you, but because your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do, adapting to the environment it's in. The problem is that adaptation makes it harder to connect with people who are actually safe. Type 10, the dream killer. This one is subtle, because they often don't look dangerous at all. They might even look like they care about you. They're the person who responds to your excitement with a long list of reasons why it won't work, who treats your ambitions as a form of naivety to be corrected, who frames their doubt as wisdom, their skepticism as protection. I just don't want to see you get hurt. I'm being realistic. I've seen people try this before. And maybe some of it even sounds reasonable. But here's what the research says. A landmark study from the University of Virginia found that individuals who pursued significant goals in environments characterized by chronic social discouragement showed measurably lower rates of goal achievement, not because their goals were unrealistic, but because repeated social discouragement depletes what psychologists call regulatory resources, the mental energy required to maintain effort over time. In other words, the dream killer doesn't have to be right about your idea being bad. They just have to be consistent about making you feel like it is. And eventually, your brain starts to agree with them. Not because the evidence supports it, but because sustained discouragement literally changes how the brain evaluates possibility. The most dangerous thing about a dream killer is that they can take the future away from you without you ever realizing what was lost.
So here's where we land. 10 behavioral patterns, all documented in psychological research, all capable of causing real, measurable harm to your mental health and sense of self. The gaslighter, who makes you doubt your own reality. The chronic critic who trains your brain to expect failure. The drama magnet who dysregulates your nervous system. The fake supporter whose ambivalence keeps you anxious. The energy vampire who leaves you depleted and isolated. The narcissist who slowly erodes your sense of identity. The passive aggressor whose unspoken hostility keeps you in constant hypervigilance. The perpetual victim who redirects accountability onto you. The compulsive liar who damages your capacity for trust.
and the dream killer, who takes your future one discouraging comment at a time. Here's the thing about all of this. Recognizing these patterns is not about labeling people. It's not about writing anyone off. It's about understanding what certain dynamics cost you and deciding whether that cost is one you can afford. Because the research is consistent on one point above all others. The quality of your close relationships is one of the single strongest predictors of long-term psychological health. Not wealth, not achievement, not status. Who you spend your time with, that's what shapes you. So choose carefully. Protect your environment the same way you'd protect anything else that matters, because it does matter, more than most people realize until it's already too late. If this gave you something to think about, the next video goes even deeper into how these patterns form and what psychology says about actually breaking free from them. I'll see you there.